So I have never given a sermon online before, but I have given lectures online. So um, I don't have a PowerPoint, so that may be a change for those who've heard sermons from me in the past. Um, that may happen to some degree at some point in later sermons, but anyway. I will be giving some stats and figures though today and having some Bible verses that aren't in the program. And we'll just go with that. This won't be a standard sermon. I feel compelled to address the social unrest we're seeing from a biblical viewpoint. A lot of us have had conversations about what's going on privately or through social media, and it's something that's all on our minds, and I feel like it's incumbent upon the church at large to address what's going on. And so I feel like we're doing our part by having a conversation on it. And if there's my hope with this is to clearly present a biblical standard for how to deal with it, but also to prompt a discussion amongst the members of the church about this. And if there's any point you disagree with me on, that's okay. I hope like after the service we can stay in the room and discuss some of the things. But what I did was I wanted to think about the issues we're facing with the Christian duties in mind. And I called this sermon the Christian response to the current social unrest or the current protests. But you could also think of it just as Christian duties in this time of crisis. What are our duties as Christians? God calls us as Christians in society, in the society at large, including non-Christians, to be just, to be compassionate, and to be wise. Those are the three aspects of this sermon: justice, compassion, and wisdom. What do these things mean? And how do we apply them to the social unrest that we're currently witnessing? Let's talk about justice. So when we see the horrific killing of George Floyd, it was a man who had a police officer kneeling on his neck for almost 9 minutes, all on video, and all the while saying, "I can't breathe." When we see that, we as believers naturally get angry and cry out for justice. When I first saw that, I remember texting or commenting. I saw it on Instagram, and it was a very politically liberal friend of mine, and I wrote and said, "This makes me so angry to see what this cop did." It's one of the few times that we actually agreed on something politically. So we see something like this and we want to correct it as Christians. We cry out for justice. Let's look at some biblical principles on what justice means. Let's see how the Bible explains justice. The Bible gives some specific examples. We're not to oppress the widow or the orphan. So that the broader category would be the weak or the poor. Exodus 22 actually says, "You shall not mistreat any widow or fatherless child." And this is often quoted in among more left-leaning Christians who have really emphasized social justice. But we need to balance out the biblical expository on this. So it also says not to give the poor legal advantages or privileges above everybody else as well. If you look at Leviticus 19:15, it reads, "You shall do no injustice in court. You shall not be partial to the poor or defer to the great, but in righteousness you shall judge your neighbor." So it's not giving the poor or those who like specifically were abandoned by their husband, like privileges under the law that nobody else has. It's the point of it is to not give them less privileges than other people have. So you're not supposed to be detrimental in the way that you treat them in society as a judge or the system, but you're also not supposed to artificially give them rights that nobody else has. Justice is where everybody is equal under the law. Now, we've heard the term equity a lot, right? And raise your hand if you have heard the term equity at your workplace or, okay, yeah. That's funny that High Greg just raised his hand. What are we doing today? It's an Anchor Church, but we use it differently. Okay, the word is thrown around a lot today in our workplaces, and I would argue it's not being used correctly. Well, I'll say that. Let me just get to the Bible verses. Okay, Psalm 99:4 says, "The king in his might loves justice. You have established equity. You have executed justice and righteousness in Jacob." So even our English translations use the word equity. So we can look it up in the dictionary. In English, it's defined as being fair or impartial, essentially treating everyone the same under the law, giving them equal opportunity under the law. Now, the left, the political left in this country, has redefined the word equity to mean equality of outcome, not equality of opportunity. I was at an official meeting at a college I teach at where a professor said, "Hey, look guys, equity does not mean equality of opportunity. Equity means equality of outcome." Now that's a very Marxist meaning, okay? Very Marxist in its philosophy. So we need to be aware of what words mean when we hear them. We as Christians believe in equality under the law, which is similar to equality of opportunity because it's biblical. This doctrine of equality under the law comes from the way God sees human beings. Genesis 1:27 says God made man in the image of God. And Galatians 3:27-28 says, "For as many of you were baptized into Christ have put on Christ. There is neither Jew nor Greek. There is neither slave nor free. There is no male and female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus." What's coming out of these verses? It's that because we're all made in the image of God, we have equal value before God. And if God sees us as having equal value, should not our own governmental institutions and laws view us in the same way? That we are all equal and should have equal opportunities, equality in justice. No one is better than anyone else in the eyes, or of more value in the eyes of God. So if you look at something like slavery, it's no coincidence so many of the abolitionists in the 19th century were Christians. William Wilberforce, for example, who led the charge against slavery in Britain, had what he called a, quote, intense religious conversion in 1785. He was also mentored by a former slave trader, John Newton, who had himself come to Christ in a strong conversion, turned his whole life around. That was the guy who wrote Amazing Grace. There's no biblical basis for racism. Everyone's made in the image of God. Whether you are white, Middle Eastern, Black, Hispanic, Asian, or of course Armenian. I mean, Armenian may be a little better than everyone else, but that's just what I've been told by certain people of that group. So Paul tells us that all men came from one man, Adam, in Acts 17:26. Now, there's very little discussion of race, even as an issue to be considered in the Bible. The one clear instance we have of race being an issue is where the Israelites are in the desert, wandering in the wilderness post-Exodus, and Moses' wife Zipporah was a Cushite from Cush, south of Egypt and above the cataracts of the Nile River, where historically the Black Africans lived. During this Exodus time, Aaron and Miriam, Moses' siblings, criticized Moses for marrying a Cushite, and then they claimed they had such authority, or they had as much authority as prophets as Moses. But God defended Moses, striking Miriam with leprosy. And sure, they were also claiming that they had prophetic authority, and that was part of God's punishment. But what's interesting is at no point does God say, and Moses, you shouldn't have married this Cushite. It's not an issue. Race is never an issue in the Bible, except for the Jews being God's chosen people. But that's not something to do with genetics. That has to do with God's sovereign choice of having a people for his own. And through the new covenant, we see God wants all men to be his own people, all races to come under the fold of the children of God. So indeed, Christians should be the greatest opponents of racism. It's a beautiful thing to be all one in the family of God. And this means that Christians should be the biggest advocates of ridding police departments of racist cops. Let me get on to the second point, compassion. Christians are to show compassion. Helping the poor in society was a command in the Old Testament. In Leviticus 23:22, it reads, "And when you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not reap your field right up to its edge, nor shall you gather the gleanings after your harvest. You shall leave them for the poor and for the sojourner. I am the Lord your God." So this is an actual command in the law that the Israelites were supposed to leave part of their harvest for the poor to eat. God cares about the poor and the downtrodden. In fact, the hallmark of the Christian is compassion for the needy. James 1:27 says, "Pure and undefiled religion in the sight of our God and Father is this, to visit orphans and widows in their distress and to keep oneself unstained by the world." When he calls this pure and undefiled religion, he's making it a central point of what we do as Christians. The Gospels explicitly point out how Jesus himself repeatedly showed compassion to people. In Matthew 25:31 through 40, Jesus talks about the final judgment and compassion being the seal of the righteous. He instructs us to feed the hungry and clothe the naked, to visit the sick and those in prison. And as he's giving the illustration, he says he's talking about dividing the unrighteous from the righteous at the final judgment. And he says, "Come, you who are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty and you gave me drink. I was a stranger and you welcomed me. I was naked and you clothed me. I was sick and you visited me. I was in prison and you came to me. And they ask, well, when did we do all these things to you, Lord? And he says, look, when you do it unto the least of these, it's as if you did it unto me. And it's this command to help those who are downtrodden, even those who are in prison. I think that if we apply this principle of compassion, and I might say justice as well, but compassion in particular, it involves listening to people tell their stories. It involves listening to Black people tell their experiences with police. I had a Black student, this girl for 2 classes at Cal State LA. She was a very good student. She got A's in both classes, and I've remained friends with her since then. In fact, she's going to come visit me in about a week and a half. She's never been up to my house. And she told me a story about how she was driving with her white boyfriend at the time. And she was pulled over by a police officer. And the boyfriend hadn't really done anything wrong with his actual, driving. But the officer questioned this girl for like 30 to 40 minutes of like, why are you in this area? What are you doing together? And things that were really bad, very racist in where it was coming from. Like she shouldn't be with a white guy. And he wanted to figure out, like, why was that the case? Where were they going? What were they up to? Now, they didn't get in trouble, nothing, they didn't do anything wrong, but it really made her upset about the way she was treated. And I think there's a lot of stories out there like this. On the other hand, we should also listen to police tell their experiences with people in the Black community. If you talk to police officers who have worked in Black neighborhoods, a lot of them will start to get jaded, or at least some of them. They'll tell you that many people in the Black neighborhoods don't respect them and don't comply with the demands of the officers. And that's tough when you have experience after experience where you have people resisting arrest or insulting you, cussing at you, not respecting your position. It's natural for people to start to judge a group based upon their experiences with that group. Just like certain African Americans may start to judge the entire police based upon their experiences with police, and judge all cops to be racist, all cops to be the enemy. You can also have the other thing happening with police, where they start to judge all Blacks as likely to give them trouble, to be disrespectful, to not comply. And it's not right, but I'm saying this is something that happens. When you get into the idea of racial profiling, this is going on, but it's also simply the idea that of probabilities, statistics. If you're a Korean shop owner and you've been shoplifted multiple times and the perpetrators are usually Black, are you going to spend your time watching the white and the Hispanic and the Asian people in your store as much as you watch or racially profile the Black customers? It's something people do naturally to protect themselves. And what these things do is they can tend to just lead to, they snowball and lead to more distrust This person did me wrong. This person was suspicious of me. I was disrespectful to this person. I don't trust these people. They're out to get me. And it just leads to no good. Christians are also called to be wise, to exercise wisdom. We have a whole book of the Bible devoted to wisdom, Proverbs. God calls Christians to be critical thinkers, not naive followers of movements. We are to test ideas, to check the evidence for purported conclusions. In Acts 17, 10 through 11, Paul calls the Bereans more noble than the Thessalonians because after Paul preached to them, they, quote, examined the scriptures daily to see if these things were so. In 1 Thessalonians 5:21, it's in the context of prophecies. And Paul says to test everything and hold on to the good. So if we're to test, things in the church, prophecies, how much more so are we to test things in the world? We're to be wise to the plots of evil men. When Jesus sent out his disciples to preach in the Judean towns in Matthew 10:16, he instructed them to be, quote, as wise as serpents and innocent as doves. As wise as serpents and innocent as doves. So we're to be innocent as doves in that our behavior, our actions should be blameless in the eyes of the world as well. Well, let me put it this way. They won't consider us blameless in the eyes of the world. But as far as us actually doing anything that's truly wrong, we need to make sure no true claim can be made against us. But we need to be wise as serpents, not naive. Jesus, in that context, said he was sending out his disciples as sheep in the midst of wolves. And there are wolves out there. I might say they're everywhere, but that might sound a bit paranoid, but there's a lot of wolves. We're to be aware also of the schemes of the devil and his minions. Ephesians 6:12 says, for we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers over this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places. We need to be really aware that when we see certain corporations, certain lobbying groups, certain internet giants having an anti-Christian agenda, that they're not doing this on their own. There are invisible forces at work in this world. We've got to keep that in mind. We're fighting not against flesh and blood, but against these cosmic powers, these rulers like high princes in the demonic realms. They do things. They don't just sit around and drink spiritual Coke all day. They have plans. They're moving people to action, and we need to be aware of that. 2 Corinthians 11:14 says that Satan disguises himself as an angel of light, and his servants disguise themselves as servants of righteousness. A lot of, if not all, I would say, of movements that we need to really be concerned about in society, political movements, social movements, disguise themselves in light, supposed righteousness, that they have the moral high ground. We have to be smart. We have to unpack agendas and see what's really going on. So with this all in mind, we need to examine what's been going on in our streets over the past few days or weeks and test whether we should support the organizations and goals behind many of the, and I'll put it in quotes, protests, because much of it has gone beyond mere protesting. I would give a word of caution to the Christian. Don't align yourself with the world's thoughts. Be very careful about aligning yourself with worldly organizations. If you find yourself constantly not only agreeing with, but championing the causes and morals of those who oppose the Christian worldview, question yourself. Those in control of the major institutions in our society, mainstream media, education, tech giants, Hollywood, many big corporations, do not believe in biblical doctrines or values. In line with what Isaiah said in chapter 5:20, they call evil good and what is good evil. They champion abortion, homosexuality, pornography, promiscuity, and other things because they do not believe in a God who designed the world and has purposes and rules for mankind. They deny the sinful nature of man. Their starting point for organizing humans in society, their political systems ignore the sinful nature of man. Like, if you're going to come up with a political theory, it might help to have an accurate assessment of the nature of humans. And theirs is inaccurate. And the systems they come up with are doomed to failure because of that. Specifically, the leaders of Black Lives Matter do not believe in the sinful nature of man. The Black clergy they celebrate, like Al Sharpton, have replaced the true biblical gospel with what's called the social gospel. It's a central doctrine in Black liberation theology. And Black liberation theology is not Christianity. It does not teach the gospel. It is twisted. You can look into this yourself if you wish, and I could go into more detail, but for time's sake, I'll go on. But the central tenets of the gospel are not there. You'd be shocked at what it believes. Now, Black Lives Matter is calling for not only defunding, but dismantling the police. Dismantling the police? Is that a good proposition? It's an anti-biblical position. It's based on this false belief that humans are basically good. So-called bad humans are thus viewed as simply misunderstood and frustrated because they lack enough money or political power. Therefore, to best deal with violent situations, one needs to send in psychologists to counsel the perpetrators. These will be the new, quote, peace officers who will de-escalate all situations with nothing more than the power of their words. This, of course, flies in the face of the biblical doctrine of the sinful nature of man. Without boundaries and fear of punishment, humans will naturally steal, cheat, fight, and attack enemies, and a bunch of other things. In fact, the Bible specifically supports law enforcement officers. Romans 13 calls rulers God's servants who do not bear the sword in vain. Indeed, the threat of lethal force is regarded as necessary to restrain evil in society. And I think that's something our society is seeming to ignore or forget, that the only way that you can keep order as a magistrate, an officer of the law, is to have the threat of lethal force. It's the only thing that will make someone ultimately obey who wishes not to obey. Look, Black Lives Matter and Antifa. Antifa's been behind, Antifa and related groups. There's a lot of different leftist organizations, but they're behind a lot of this looting, inciting people to loot and to burn things down. Black Lives Matter and Antifa are Marxist, communist organizations that are seeking to overthrow the government. They really are. A counterterrorism expert, John Guandolo, an FBI agent for 13 years, documents this. He studied these groups. The riots are coordinated. Leftist organizations have been pre-staging piles of bricks, like, oh, look at this stuff on Fifth Street. This big pile of bricks is just here, all stacked up nice. How did that get there? They've been left there by these organizations. Police officers have been targeted. If we talk specifically about Black Lives Matter, it started out as just a project, a website of the organization called Freedom Road Socialist Organization. Socialist Organization. The Twitter hashtag Black Lives Matter started in 2013 after Trayvon Martin's death at the gun of George Zimmerman. And then hands up, don't shoot became its slogan in response to Michael Brown's death in 2014. Black Lives Matter was built on the Trayvon Martin shooting in Florida and Michael Brown in Ferguson, on these two cases, and thus it was built on lies. The complete investigations in both of these cases showed that the two Black men involved were not the innocent victims Black Lives Matter still to this day portrays them to be, but instead violent perpetrators. For example, the Obama Department of Justice thoroughly investigated the Michael Brown shooting and issued a report. This is after Obama had talked really bad about it and how it was such an awful injustice. And the report from his own Justice Department showed that Michael Brown robbed a convenience store before being stopped by a police officer. He then attacked the officer by reaching through the squad car window to repeatedly slug the cop. At 6'4", 300 pounds, Brown was a formidable physical force to contend with. As he reached for the officer's gun, the officer was forced to shoot him in the hand. Brown then fled and the officer pursued on foot. The officer ordered Brown to stop but didn't shoot. Brown then turned and rushed at the officer, and the officer still didn't shoot. He showed incredible restraint, according to the witnesses. Brown then walked away, but then he turned and rushed at the officer again, this time at full speed and without stopping. The officer was forced to shoot him. The story that Michael Brown was on his knees with his hands up and was shot by the officer was proven to be a complete fabrication by the many witnesses of the shooting. And those that said that, like in the grand jury trial, said, oh, well, actually, I wasn't really there. I just heard somebody who said they were there say that. Black Lives Matter has a certain mission. They have certain beliefs. They believe that patriarchy and capitalism are two of the biggest enemies in society. They want to destroy the traditional family and heterosexual norms. You can find this on their websites. If you look at what we believe, it says we disrupt the Western prescribed nuclear family structure requirement by supporting each other as extended families and villages that collectively care for one another. That is very Marxist. Marx wanted to destroy the nuclear family and basically have the state be the family. Marx wanted to have exchange of wives between men, hold them in common. We foster a queer affirming network. When we gather, we do so with the intention of freeing ourselves from the tight grip of heteronormative thinking, or rather the belief that all in the world are heterosexual unless he or she disclose otherwise. So they have a very clear anti-biblical agenda. And it's no surprise that George Soros, if you know anything about George Soros, via his organizations, has given Black Lives Matter $33 million. So be very careful in using the hashtag Black Lives Matter on your Twitter, on your Instagram. If you want to go out and support George Floyd and call for police reform, that's a good thing. But when you put up Black Lives Matter, are you endorsing that organization? Are you simply affirming the God-ordained equality of Black people, or are you giving the organization Black Lives Matter undue credit and attention and legitimacy in the eyes of the public? This is what calls for wisdom. to not give in to peer pressure and to think about what your actions entail. What will be the consequences? Is it really supportive of God's kingdom? Antifa, which is supposed to be anti-fascist, right? Anti-fascism. Its roots are in the I'm going to butcher this German name, but Anti-Fascistische, Action, which was it's an organization founded by the Stalinist Communist Party of Germany, the KPV, in 1932.
$700.
What was that? Okay. So Antifa, it's so funny. They're against haters, against hate speech, against these fascists out there, so-called, that are going to restrict equity and freedom and rights. It's so interesting, fascists, the Nazis under Hitler, had these thugs that would go around and initiate violence against Jews and beat people up. If Antifa is so anti-fascist, why do they use the exact same tactics? They shut down conservative speakers from speaking at universities, and not only do they do that, but they intimidate anyone who would support them. They intimidate them with violence. At Berkeley, they smashed windows, destroyed property, lit things on fire. Where's the equity there? Where's the peacefulness there? And make no mistake, Antifa and related organizations are organizing what's going on right now. They're taking the opportunity to do something much more than protesting racist cops. They want this to be a revolution, to overthrow the foundational principles America was built on. Natural rights that come from God, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness or property, if you get back to John Locke. They don't believe in those things. They don't believe in God. They don't believe we have natural rights. It's all about control from their anti-biblical viewpoint and suppressing what they consider evil Christian ideas. That people who believe that homosexuality is a sin, people who believe in freedom of religion, people who believe in traditional marriage, people who believe abortion is gone, these people should be silenced and ultimately re-educated if they're going to be allowed to exist in society. Look at what's going on. We see examples of this. Seattle has a new Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone, CHAZ for short. It's these protesters took over the police's East Precinct and 6 blocks adjacent to it. And they've set up barricades, and they've put graffiti, spray paint all over with their signs, and they're living out there. And the mayor and the police department are letting them do it. And what's the message they're preaching? One of the activists said, quote, "We need to align ourselves with the global struggle that acknowledges that the United States plays a role in radicalized capitalism. Radicalized capitalism is built upon patriarchy, white supremacy, and classism." Patriarchy is a key word for, fathers being the head of a household, which is a very biblical concept. They extend that idea to the rest of society, that men shouldn't have so much control. And politically, the Seattle City Council has already begun to champion protesters' demands. The socialist alternative councilwoman, Kashma Sawant, declared the takeover, quote, a victory against, quote, the militarized police force of the police establishment and the capitalist state. So she's against capitalism, outspoken, which has to do with freedom, the liberty to have your own business, to pursue happiness and the means to achieve a living in your own way. So let's test the claims here. We hear a lot about systemic racism as being the founding or the core culprit that the protesters are protesting against. What is systemic racism or institutionalized racism? Well, first of all, what's racism? The dictionary, if I summarize it, has it as a belief in racial genetic superiority and discrimination and hatred of certain people based on that. But the left has redefined racism. They've redefined the term as only being attributable to the race in power. I've had people tell me this, leftists tell me this. Therefore, blacks, by definition, cannot be racist against whites. Even if the blacks discriminate against the whites, they are always allowed to do that without being called racist by the new definition. This is something we as Christians need to be very aware of, is words, slogans. What does the word mean? Because you can have something that sounds good, but the meaning is not good. Now, systemic or institutionalized racism came from sociology professors. And the idea is because the US was founded as a racist nation, racism is, quote, embedded in all social institutions, structures, and social relations in our society, all of them. It's a fundamental part of the political structure, our laws, the economy, our schools, our religions, even our families, how we unconsciously think and act. So the big question is, can this be empirically supported? When I learned about social science and like the scientific methodology of social science, it was actually based on data. I've heard very little data to support the idea of systemic racism. In my circles, it's simply a matter of blind faith. You must accept that systemic racism exists, or you yourself are a racist, clearly. But if you ask for data, empirical data, to support this broad contention across all of society, it's a sweeping, huge contention. If you ask for evidence, you are not an academic. You are a racist and a bigot, which is quite opposite of what an academic is supposed to be. So, is there evidence of systemic racism? Roland G. Fryer, an African-American Harvard economics professor, did a study of 1,300 police shootings in 2016. He said the results stunned him. It showed that blacks are not more likely to be fired upon than whites. In fact, they are 20% less likely to be fired upon in cases where the suspect was resisting arrest, fleeing, or attacking an officer. He did, however, find that blacks were more likely to be treated worse by officers when it comes to physical contact, such as being pushed up against a wall or on the ground. His recommendation was this, I'm quoting, "Black Lives Matter should seek solutions within their own communities rather than changing the behaviors of police and other external forces." In 2015, another study, 50% of the victims of police shootings were white, 26% were black. And some have tried to argue that this is evidence of racial bias against blacks because they only represent 15% of the population. However, it's been pointed out that blacks account for a disproportionate percentage of major crimes, including 62% of robberies, 57% of murders, and 45% of assaults. 62% of robberies, even though they're only 15% of the population. If you look at the number of blacks being killed by police, you can look at the Washington Post, okay? They've been keeping statistics since 2015. In 2019, just over 1,000 people were shot by police, fatally shot. In 802 places, the race of the person was recorded. And I want to give Laura a shout out on this one because it was through her Instagram that it brought me to my attention. The of these 802 cases, 371 were white, 236 were black. There were a total of 10 unarmed blacks killed. And in only 2 of the 10 cases were there even grounds, like a possible grounds for charging the officer. The 8 out of the 10 were so crystal clear there was nothing to charge the officer with. So in 2019, you've got possibly 2 unarmed blacks killed by police. Look at 2018 figures for how many Black Americans were murdered by other citizens, most of whom, the vast majority of whom, were other blacks. 7,400 in 2018. We do have a crisis in this country of blacks being murdered, but the numbers don't show the crisis as being by the police. They show it as black on black crime. And it's something that needs to be rectified. What's interesting is that we hear about this systemic racism in police departments. But in a 2019 study published by the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, white officers are not more likely to shoot black civilians than black or Hispanic officers are. And because of this data, the left has now redefined systemic racism. They've changed the term once again. So they've now lumped black police officers in with whites as perpetrators of systemic racism of blacks on the street. You can find this online. I'm not making this up. Isn't that, how does a black police officer be racist against another black? Perhaps the reason he might be reacting in a discriminatory way is because of his experiences with blacks who have not complied, who have disrespected officers. I'm saying in those cases, it's possible that's the reason why. And I'm not saying this isn't a problem, but are we having the right approach, the right solution? There's something very telling that exposes an agenda behind what we're seeing on the news. Why is it I've never seen a single unarmed white being shot by police making it to the news cycle? Why is it we don't hear about these cases of unarmed whites being shot by police? Oh, because they never happen. Wrong. They do. At a higher rate than with blacks. Let me give you some examples. Or in 2015, okay? The white victims of a fatal police shooting included a 50-year-old suspect in a domestic assault in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, who ran at an officer with a spoon. He got shot. A 28-year-old driver in Des Moines, Iowa, who exited his car and walked quickly towards an officer after a car chase. He got shot. And a 21-year-old suspect in a grocery store robbery in Akron, Ohio, who had escaped on a bike and who did not remove his hands from his waistband when ordered to do so. He got shot. They were all white. Now, if they had been black, do you think they might have made the news? Of course they would have. But what's happening is in cases of injustice against blacks, it's being used by unbiblical groups to try to inculcate the public with propaganda and incite a violent revolution that's going to overturn the godly principles this country was founded on. You know what's missing from this conversation? Personal responsibility. 77% of black children are born out of wedlock. Only 39% of black children live with both parents. Black children have a great lack of fathers in the home. And I should note that 70% of all juvenile offenders in state reform institutions were raised in fatherless homes. 70%. It has a huge impact when you don't have a father in the home. And that's not to say that those who didn't and who were only raised by their mother are destined to turn out to be horrible, irresponsible people. There's lots of people who are wonderful, good citizens and good Christians who are only raised by mom, but it's harder. And there's a great impact on kids without having a father figure, especially with males in inculcating crime. And this figure includes 60% of all rapists, 72% of all murderers, and 70% of long-term inmates. Entrenched multi-generational poverty is largely Black, like generation after generation on welfare. We took in an African-American lady in our home who had some drug abuse problems. She's told us not only was she on welfare, her mother was on welfare and her grandmother was on welfare. Intergenerational. And I'll tell you what, she was terribly irresponsible. We gave her opportunities for help. She didn't take us up on it. And this generational poverty is intricately intertwined with the collapse of the nuclear family in the inner city. If you look at the historical figures of and social data for Blacks before Lyndon Johnson's War on Poverty, which started in 1964, if you look at the figures from like 1964, 1965, the out-of-wedlock birth rate among the Black community was 21%. By 2017, this figure had risen to what we said, a whopping 77%. When you create what Lyndon Johnson called the Great Society, the war on poverty, and all the government benefits, welfare programs, food stamps, and the like that come without any restrictions, you incentivize bad behavior. It's not a Black problem. It's an incentivization problem based upon a fundamental misunderstanding of human nature. If you don't recognize there's a sinful nature and you don't have government programs that include bad consequences for bad behavior, where you lose your money, then you're going to incentivize bad behavior. And what we have in a lot of Black neighborhoods is out of wedlock pregnancy, followed by out of wedlock pregnancy from a different father, followed by out of wedlock pregnancy from yet a third father. And the government supports the mothers on welfare. In fact, they get more money for each child that they've had. Here's the takeaway. There's clearly a big problem in the Black community. This is a key point. And the question is, do we as Christians even care about the current plight of Blacks in this country? Because sometimes we get so caught up in arguing with those we disagree with over the true problem and the solution, what's causing it, and we disagree with the certain leftist approaches, that we forget to care about the Black community. And what responsibility does the church have in solving this problem? Well, first, what responsibility do the Black churches have in this? It's a shame in my mind. As you know, I'm very, interracial with my church-going habits, but that we're so separated by race in our churches. But that's how it is right now. What are the Black churches doing about it? Are they preaching the true gospel? Or are they preaching Black liberation theology and the social gospel? Are they preaching that the Holy Spirit can come into people and keep them from sexual immorality, keep them with a clean mouth, help them to be responsible and keep jobs, be on time, work hard, don't make excuses? How about the white churches? What responsibility how about the white, Asian, Korean, interracial, all the other churches? What responsibility do we have in this? Are we ready to do something about it? When's the last time you thought about what could I do to help the Black community? Yeah, we all have different ministries, but I'm saying, have you considered it? Like, are there tutoring programs? What's going on? It's a problem that the church needs to be concerned about. Christians also have a duty to speak the truth in this time. And that, in its highest form, is to preach the gospel. And the solution to all of these problems is the gospel. Racism dissolves in the light of the gospel. Irresponsible behavior, sexual promiscuity, violence, and crime all die in the resurrecting power of Jesus Christ. And sometimes in our work environments, it's difficult. There's a lot of pressure, especially in public jobs, to keep your mouth shut about the truth. And I do believe there's times to speak and times not to speak. But we do need to be speaking the truth in some fashion with wisdom and when opportunities arise. All right, that's my sermon. Thank you for bearing with the length of it. But I thought that it was important to address this. And yes, it was not a typical sermon, and other sermons I give will not be so political. But I thought this one, in this case, it was important to apply the Bible to a crisis. Let's have a word of prayer and then go on with our service. Dear Heavenly Father, I pray that you would give us wisdom, give us courage, and have our minds set on you and trusting in you during this time. Let us not be swayed by propaganda or the pressures of what I would call the sheep in society. They're sheep of a different shepherd. We want to be sheep, but of the true shepherd. And may our boldness come from the power of the Holy Spirit and in knowing that we have victory through Christ, who has conquered all the principalities of the air and death and destruction and the devil himself. In Jesus' name, amen.